At the basis of it, I think authentic assessment is really a faculty member thinking about what it is that they want their students to be able to do once they're gone from the university as a result of having taken their class.
Welcome to Here's the Deal, Teaching and Learning by Design, a podcast created by Jennifer Sias, a senior instructional designer in the Office of Distance Education and E-Learning at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. This podcast brings together stakeholders, primarily from UNCW, to discuss best practices in teaching, learning, instructional design and technology, as well as videography, and the roles they play in strengthening online, hybrid, and web-enhanced teaching and learning environments.
This podcast is produced for informational purposes. The views expressed are those of the individual speakers and may not represent those of the University of North Carolina, Wilmington.
Welcome to Episode 3, Authentic Assessment. I'm Jennifer Sias, a senior instructional designer in Deal and the host of this podcast. This marks our first subject-specific thematic episode. We open the series with 2 episodes about what we do in Deal and who we are. Now, we are diving into topics related to the work we do as we work with faculty on their online, hybrid, and web-enhanced courses. In this episode, we explore a specific kind of assessment that faculty design and use in their online courses. Authentic assessment was front and center this past spring 2025, as another instructional designer and I worked with 2 nursing faculty on a course they were designing. I will talk to that faculty member a little later in the episode. First, though, let's situate the topic and the term authentic assessment. There are numerous definitions of the term. One explanation I found is that they, quote, involve the application of knowledge and skills in real-world situations, scenarios, or problems. Authentic assessments create a student-centered learning experience by providing students opportunities to problem solve, inquire, and create new knowledge and meaning, end quote. That definition comes from Nicole Messier, an instructional designer at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Let's hear more from the voice we heard at the top of this episode, Lee Bullard, who is UNCW's General Education Assessment Coordinator.
Authentic assessment is really a faculty member thinking about what it is that they want their students to be able to do once they're gone from the university as a result of having taken their class. So starting with what do I want my students to be able to do, and then designing your teaching and your assessments around that piece, as opposed to just thinking, oh, my students need to know the parts of a cell or the bones in the human body. I was a science teacher, so that's my framework. And then I think it's so important, for all the reasons I spoke about education, I think that we owe students, all students, the opportunity to be able to demonstrate that they can do the things a course wants them to do outside of the idea of a traditional assessment, which focuses more on like rote memorization and just providing information on a pencil paper test type of thing. It really involves a process of applying the information and the skills that were learned in a course.
I also spoke to Dr. Joyce Behuth, Associate Director for Institutional Assessment for the Watson College of Education and the Cameron School of Business. Here's how she defines authentic assessment.
Authentic assessment, as the term indicates, is assessment in the real world. So what is it that we expect our students to be able to do once they graduate and join the workforce? This is what we need to prepare them for. So in real life, we need to prepare our students to think critically, to apply their knowledge, to be familiar with what is expected of them and get themselves ready for that, be motivated to employ all the skills and knowledge that they have acquired over the years once they get to their career.
For this episode, I also spoke to 3 faculty members, 2 of whom are nursing faculty. Dr. Jen McCall is one of those nursing faculty members, along with Dr. Rhonda Vega, who developed the class I mentioned earlier, the one that inspired this episode on authentic assessment. Here is Dr. McCall on how she defines the term.
I see it as an application of applied learning, which seems redundant, but applied learning is really important. You can read a story and then you can think about the story, but if the student isn't taking that information or that story and putting it in real world application, then you don't necessarily know that they're getting what you want to out of what you're teaching. And so I see this as kind of an extension of that, where we have an applied learning type of scenario, and now we're assessing them using that applied learning model. So that's kind of how I saw it in designing these work products that we want them to do for us.
The other nursing professor I interviewed, Dr. April Braswell, situates authentic assessment in the larger realm of applied learning. And she makes a good point about how different disciplines might have slightly different interpretations of terminology.
Depending on where you go in the literature and, quite frankly, which discipline you're reviewing in, these terms can be interchangeable. However, in my experience and in the state of the science as it relates to higher education and online learning, an authentic assessment is one piece of applied learning. You know, the term applied learning and authentic assessment both relate to real world or practical type experiences, right? Terms that we know are involved in both of those concepts. But in my interpretation, applied learning is more like an umbrella or an overarching pedagogical approach, while authentic assessment is just one way to facilitate or integrate the tenets of that pedagogical approach. For example, as instructors, we do more than just provide assessments of learning. You know, we do more than measure and evaluate our learners' outcomes, right? And assessment is just one part of that applied learning. But what about learning activities? You know, those are typically ungraded activities that are still meant to facilitate learning, and many of them are applied learning approaches or instructional tools or instructional materials, if that makes sense.
Now, let's consider some examples. What might an authentic assessment look like in practice? Let's hear about what inspired this episode, the authentic assessment that resulted from the collaboration between Dr. Jen McCall and Dr. Rhonda Vega, and my colleague, instructional designer Tara Hours, and me as a senior instructional designer. Jen and Rhonda were working with us on designing and developing a course called CLR 501, Clinical Research Monitoring and Ethics. Incidentally, Jen and Rhonda were teaching a section of the course simultaneously, and that allowed them to, in a sense, try out some assignments in real time with students. Dr. Jen McCall.
I always find discussions really important to do in an online class because I want them to mimic the interaction that we would have in an in-person class as much as possible. And so whenever I have a discussion board, I always require that interaction piece. But a lot of times, and thinking about this as an ethics class, right? Ethics is not just let's read and think. It really should be applying ethics. And so we had this we could have them read something, we could have them look at something and then just write what they think, and then they write to their comments, oh, I agree, or oh, I don't agree. But we really wanted to, in this discussion we were having amongst ourselves, something a little bit more in depth and really trying to probe what we were trying to teach them in the module. And the module the module itself is participant selection for clinical trials and IRB oversight. So looking at, from the ethical standpoint, how do we select participants, especially participants that could have, we call them special populations, but a lot of times it's easier to think of them as vulnerable populations. How do you incorporate ethically children in clinical trials? How do you ethically incorporate cognitively impaired people in clinical trials? And so it's kind of looking at all of these. And I have this TED Talk that I absolutely love, and I use it in one of my freshman seminar classes too. And it's by Dr. Boguma Kaibizan Titanji. And she's fabulous. She's a doctor who works in sub-Saharan Africa. And I would really recommend that you look at this TED Talk. It's called Ethical Riddles in HIV Research. And it's so looking at participant selection. It's important to do clinical research and clinical trials in the area where you have the highest population of an affected disease. And in HIV, that is sub-Saharan Africa. And in this TED Talk, she talks about how the clinical trial comes in, they run the clinical trial, they do the IRB oversight, they have the informed consent, which is an incredibly important aspect of a trial and ethically conducting a trial, and IRB oversight of that. But then the trial is over. And what happens to the participants after the trial is over? So she talks in very much encourage you to go look at this, about how the participants get very sick because they no longer have their medications, they don't have access to the health care. They had people taking them to the clinic and back, and now they have to walk to the clinic. And it really kind of gives you, we're in this Western world where it's very easy to go get a doctor online. It's not necessarily the case in all parts of the world. So I like to have students see this, and the way she describes it, you can feel what it might be like to be in that situation. And so we were talking about this, and we were going to have them look at this TED Talk, and then, what do you think about that, and discuss it. But in the module, we have the vulnerable population piece, but we also have this IRB oversight and the ethical responsibilities of an IRB oversight. So we came up with this idea of having a role-playing game, where they watch the TED Talk, they think about it like we would want them to think about it, but then in the first step, the first thing they have to do is put themselves in the role of an IRB member who is overseeing this application to do a clinical trial with this vulnerable or this special population. What special or what additional questions would you have as an IRB member for a study with this special group? So it encourages them not only to think of this from a global perspective as, wow, this is really different than my life, but if I'm going to go and have a job where I am an IRB member and I have to oversee a study, I need to think about what are all of the considerations that I can come up with for this. So we ask them to do that, and that's their initial post. And then for the interaction, what we want them is then to switch, because it's not all one-sided. Ethics is never one-sided, right? So we want them to switch and put themselves in the role of the study investigator, the people who are applying for that IRB permission to do the study. How would you answer these questions? And we want them to consider, I think we put in the prompt, the Belmont report, that ethical framework that they learned in Module 1. So they're building throughout the semester on what they learned in Module 1, and they're bringing that those considerations, but also things that we talked about in Module 3 of various ethical considerations that they learned.
The discussion board, which involved students role-playing real-life roles in the field, wasn't the only innovative assignment Jen and Rhonda incorporated in the course. Let's hear Jen describe an AI assignment they developed.
So one of the assignments we asked them to do, and this was based on, we got inspired from this from a guest speaker that came to our first faculty meeting, our faculty retreat of the year, and talking about AI. And AI is an unavoidable aspect of higher education. It's coming. We have to teach students how to use it ethically, right? Ethics, responsibly, and what the pitfalls are. So I've been kind of playing around with some of these ideas, Rhonda and I have. And this one was, well, let's have a debate with AI. So let's ask AI a question. And so they have to set it up, and they have to ask them a question, and then they have a debate back and forth with AI, because it teaches them how to use the tool somewhat, but it also teaches what the limitations were. And so we asked them, the prompt we asked them was, is it ethical to use AI in clinical trials? And most of the students actually asked AI to debate that it's not ethical. And it was really surprising. We asked them at the end of that to write a reflection. What did you think about this assignment? And it was really surprising, the number of students that were just shocked at how well it articulated how it's not ethical to use AI in clinical trials, and then having to come up with reasons to debate back and forth. And we thought that was, because when you have ethics, you're going to have two different sides and be able to think about these situations from two different sides, and using the AI tool.
More on feedback Jen and Rhonda received.
I think they were surprised. I think they really liked it. You get feedback when they write in a reflection, or you get feedback when you at the end of the semester. They were really surprised by how some of these went, and it really emphasized some of those ethical conundrums that you can come to when you're trying to debate AI, or if you're trying to put yourself in different roles and different perspectives. I was really surprised at some of the things that they came up with and some of the arguments they had with the AI, or in the case of the Sub-Saharan Africa, when they come up with questions. What questions do you have if you're an IRB member? And some of those, were what you would expect. Consent was a big one. They had consent, and they hit on consent being, how are you going to deal with consent? How are you going to deal with stipends and coercion? Beneficence is a big part of Belmont, and they hit those. But what I was really surprised with were some of the things that they came up with that were not necessarily what we taught them directly. So it's of course aspects of ethics and things. There's things they pick up, but directly, if I ask them to respond to this in terms of Belmont, they need to talk about respect for persons and beneficence and justice. And some of the students, like one came up with, how are you going to deal with distrust in medical research in this population? Another one came, how are you going to deal with the cultural stigma of HIV research in this particular special population? So I was really impressed with some of the things that they pulled in, and the assignment challenged them to be able to do that. So it had strengths. It had surprising strengths. Some of the weaknesses as you're developing a course and trying to come up with authentic assessments is you don't really know how things go wrong. And it happens, right? And so a lot of times we'll tell the students, hey, we're designing a course. Let us know how it's going. It's really important for feedback. With the AI assignment, our intent was to have them, say something, and then the AI say something, and then they say something equally weighted back. We found a couple of students, AI will run with it if you let it. So we have already revised this assignment to say, tell AI to stick to 1 to 3 paragraphs so it doesn't write you a book that you have to read and address. And then some of them, instead of having a debate with AI, they ended up just asking a couple of, well, what about this, or what about this, and probing AI's perspective on the ethics rather than having a true debate. So that can be a challenge, especially when you're experimenting with assessments, to be able to just to understand it's a bit of an experiment and you can adapt it for the future semesters.
Ironically, another faculty member I interviewed discussed AI as a tool when considering authentic assessment. Dr. Sherry Conklin, an associate professor of instructional technology in the Watson College of Education, however, mentioned that it could aid instructors who might wish to develop authentic assignments.
I think from the instructor point of view, you can take an idea and bounce it into AI and ask it to help you make it more authentic. How can you really pull in the students' experiences, and how can you get them to apply the concepts in a more meaningful way? So I think tech tool-wise, that is something that faculty, instructors can do.
Let's return to a nursing professor from whom we heard before, Dr. April Braswell, who spoke about authentic assessment in the broader category of applied learning. An associate professor in the College of Health and Human Services, Dr. Braswell epitomizes innovation in instruction. A few years ago, she developed a virtual pediatric comfort care clinic and worked with our team to design and film segments to create an environment where students can be immersed in real-life scenarios. I should note that their work was recognized in the form of a Silver Telly Award for the video series. Telly Awards, by the way, are an annual program recognizing excellence in video and television production across various platforms, including television, online video, and social media. Additionally, Dr. Braswell, along with Dr. Colleen O'Brien, another nursing professor, and 2 members of the DEAL team, Brittany Denning, a senior instructional designer, and Avian Harris, a former instructional technologist, authored an article about the clinic in the journal Nurse Educator. In the article, Development of a Virtual Pediatric Holistic Comfort Care Clinic, they used the terms authentic assessment, applied learning, and immersive. Here again, April Braswell.
So in the context of our pediatric comfy care clinics, the term immersive centers on the actual real-time experience of the learners. So this is an asynchronous doctoral class. Our family nurse practitioner students can participate in their learning activities and assignments on their own by the due date. However, while they're engaged in the clinic encounters and in the post-conference follow-up videos, they are what we term as immersed as a student in one of two major ways. So in their pre-conference videos, when they're orienting to their patients, they're actually immersed in that simulated virtual clinic, right? But then again, when they're viewing the follow-up post-conference video, they're immersed as if they're in a lecture hall or a classroom, and all of their peers are right there with them and their instructor right in front of them. And this is really important to me. I have students leave me comments and feedback about this part of my class all the time. Online education students are often socially isolated, many of them working full-time and having a significant amount of work, school, and home life balance. So I put a significant amount of effort into aiming for removal of some of that social isolation by including these post-conference videos.
I asked April to expand a bit and talk about what students do that could be considered authentic.
There are a lot of things that our students actually do in our virtual clinics which make them experience, something authentic and applied. Going back to that definition of immersive, what they're doing is actually entering these virtual clinic encounters, in the learning management system. We even use language that enhance the authenticity and immersion. So things like, welcome to the UNCW Pediatric Comfy Care Clinic, or thank you for dropping by the clinic to see Kaylee today. We use a simulated medical facility with an examination table and an ophthalmoscope, an otoscope, and a stethoscope, and an actual simulation room in the School of Nursing that allows students to feel that immersion and enhance what they're actually doing virtually. They're also reviewing medical records, so they have to look at a patient health history or look at the parent and caregiver information and a physical examination. This is coupled with images or videos that, really clears up that patient presentation for them. A lot of that authenticity of doing comes in when they have to make a diagnosis or create a plan and document that in the patient's chart. And the patient's chart happens to be a place where their peers can see, and they interact and they critically appraise one another's decision making with regard to that diagnosis. In our newer virtual clinic, the Pediatric Comfy Care and Growth and Development Center, students are directed to sections of the chart where they can look at things like vision and hearing screening, growth charts, and they can order vaccines at a vaccine clinic. Here they can also make assumptions in a safe learning space about that child's health based on the data in the patient chart. And then we've also integrated a direct feedback system, which I did, of course, with the help of the Office of eLearning, in that activity where the students can actually click on a delivery system of feedback to find out whether or not they're correct.
I followed up by asking April in what way the assignments are authentic.
Authenticity, when it comes to our higher education assessments, focuses on the real world or practical application, which we already talked about. But in our clinic, learners are not getting exams, right? They're not getting quizzes with multiple choice or fill in the blank options for that assessment. Their actual authenticity in assessment is a written interactive responses coupled with an immersive experience of entering the clinic and clicking on that patient's chart and reviewing it, just like they would do in real life, even if it's a telehealth or in an electronic health record in the clinic. As I explained with the Growth and Development Center, they're doing for children, what those children actually will need in real life. And that's the reason we have two virtual clinics. We don't just see kids when they're sick, we also see them when they're well, so they have two types of clinics in our course.
So why are authentic assessments important? Once again, April Braswell.
Authenticity is an important concept across all higher education degree tracks, right? Speaking from an advanced practice nursing perspective, evidence is clear that without authenticity or authentic assessments, including things like simulation, our students would not be as prepared or comfortable to go out and do the tasks and the skills that we're educating them for. And quite frankly, the ones that I'm educating them for are held in the context of risk for both the patient and the clinician. So our students need to know how to diagnose something correctly that will save a life, to decrease sickness time, or prevent disability in adulthood. Our students need to know how to provide the correct treatment or no treatment at the right time for the right patient's age, the right patient's race, ethnicity, gender, history of chronic illness, and even have to consider things that patients are on as far as other medications. Without those authentic assessments or real world experience, the preparation would be lacking, and then cost of additional time learning after graduation would also increase. I have past students email me all the time. In fact, this just happened. A student emailed me to say, Dr. Braswell, I just saw Kaylee fever fuss in my office today. And this just happened not too long ago. And what the student was trying to tell me is that she saw a newborn infant with sepsis, high risk for morbidity or mortality, and that means the baby was so sick they're at risk for death, okay? She saw this patient in her office and she knew what to do. That to me is enough proof on why authentic assessment is important.
Well, it would seem that authentic assessments are the way to go. There are so many positive outcomes related to them, as we have heard. Yet, I feel the need to pump the brakes a little at this point. There is still a role for other types of assessments in the curriculum. And when it comes to authentic assessments, they pose some challenges, whether they are used in fully online, hybrid, web-enhanced, or totally traditional learning environments. I asked my guests about some of these challenges. First up, Joyce Behuth.
Okay, some programs may not lend themselves as easily to authentic assessment as others. A more challenging aspect is probably training faculty to be able to implement authentic assessment, reduce their load possibly, because authentic assessment requires detailed feedback, and this is very time consuming on the teacher's time and energy, and also the faculty needs to be familiar with what is required from industry at this time. So it is time consuming in different ways, making themselves familiar with what is required and finding the time to come up with activities similar to real-time or real-life situations and provide detailed feedback.
Next, Lee Bullard.
Authentic assessments require more work on the part of a faculty member than traditional assessments do. So if we think of something like a Scantron test, which is very easy to score, and it's even easy to write if you're using like a test bank, an authentic assessment is a little bit more involved in that you have to design an experience. It may be a culture shift for a department. You may get pushback on it that an authentic assessment is not rigorous enough, it's too subjective, and so there's a lot of working pieces that go into making the shift from a traditional assessment to an authentic assessment.
Jen McCall noted that authentic assessments pose both challenges and opportunities.
I think that it's important to have them because you're going to capture things that you really didn't even imagine that you were looking for. But it can be very difficult to standardize. Like, how are you going to grade? I want you to think deeply on this. Like, that's very difficult to standardize that a rubric per se. To somebody can really go out there on a handful of words where somebody else has to write a novel. That's difficult for it. So I find that it works really well to balance some of these more thought-provoking and giving them the freedom to go out on case studies and really elaborate on what they think with something more traditional like a quiz or a written response to a prompt that's a little bit more, you can wrap your head around it and you can wrap your learning modules around it and you know that they're getting the basics there, but you still allow them the freedom in other assessments to go where their curiosity takes them.
Jen further reflected on the opportunities and challenges the online environment can pose.
Yeah, this is a tricky one, right? Because this was an online class, and I'm always worried that my students are going to get lost when I'll record a lecture. I'll post announcements, but how do I know when they're in the classroom, I can get right there and ask them, what do you think about this? Or I see you thinking, your face is thinking, and not all students raise their hand and talk, and you can encourage them to pull that information out of them, that discussion and that thought. That's really hard to do in an online environment. And I think that the authentic assessments is a way that you can ensure that happens, because every single student has to respond thoughtfully to a prompt. They can take it in any direction they want, as long as they're, the role playing, for example. What questions do you have? You could ask any question that had to do anything with any of the IRB oversight that we've learned, any of the ethical frameworks, any of the big picture things. And so you can get those thought-provoking responses out of them. But you have to design the assessment intentionally, or it can really go off the rails, as we kind of learned with our AI one a bit. We structured that one a little better on revision.
Sherry Conklin also reflected on challenges and opportunities the online environment poses with authentic assessments.
It could be difficult whether it's face-to-face, online, or hybrid, because you have to craft that assessment in a certain manner to be able to get the students to pull in their experiences. And again, I work with master level students, so I think it would be more difficult for faculty who teach undergraduates who have yet to experience where they're moving. Or let's say you have an undergraduate who is taking a course for their not for their major. What's it called?
Like an elective?
An elective. So I think it could be a little bit more difficult just in general of how do you make this content relevant to that student? How do you connect what they're going to do with either what they have done or what they may do, because they can't sometimes foreshadow how they could use this.
Let's round out the discussion of challenges and opportunities the online environment poses where authentic assessments are concerned with Lee Bullard.
There's a ton of possibilities, but I'm going to start with what I see as one of the larger challenges, and that is that all students come to the format with different levels of digital literacy. And so as educators, we have to take that into consideration, that I've seen students who don't know how to save a file to a hard drive, and then of course there's students who are over there writing code when they come in as freshmen. And so I think that is one of the biggest challenges, is making the assumption that all students are coming in at the same starting point with knowing how to live and how to live in the digital world, but also how to use an online learning management system, because those can be a little bit tricky. I say that as a new doctoral student because I struggled a little bit with figuring those out. But I think the opportunities are very rich in online environments because they provide so many additional ways of putting a piece of work together for a student. They can do a multimedia piece of work. They can embed links in a project. And there's a lot of pieces embedded into our learning management software that allows easy ways for students to collaborate, to work together, and to put those pieces into an authentic assessment product that we just can't do with a pencil and paper scenario.
If authentic assessments pose challenges, but are worth it nonetheless, what support might we offer faculty to develop and use them? Let's hear again from Lee Bullard, followed by Joyce Behuth. First, Lee.
Offering, if we're talking about the university writ large, is offering opportunities for faculty to come together to work and talk about their practice. So centers for teaching like CTE here at the university offers a lot of opportunities for that, providing time for faculty to do that because everybody's busy, and providing resources that can help frame their understanding of what authentic assessment is if they're new to it.
And now, Joyce.
Faculty are the content experts of that area, so I usually try to stay away from focusing on content per se. And I would support the faculty with rubrics, with assessment strategies or techniques or formats, look at how they would weigh some assignments or some components on a rubric. So I will just facilitate the assessment part of that task.
Because Joyce and Lee specifically work in the area of assessment for the university, I wanted to learn more about how authentic assessments might align with institutional goals and accreditation. First, some insight from Joyce Verhuth, who, as I mentioned, is the Associate Director for Institutional Assessment for Watson College of Education and the Cameron School of Business.
Whether we're talking about institutional accreditation or specialized accreditation, the focus is always on employer satisfaction and graduate satisfaction. And this is what we are trying to seek through authentic assessment, in the sense of if we figure out exactly what the employers in today's world expect of our graduates as of the first day, so as for them to hit the ground running, then we can get the students ready, and this would meet our employer satisfaction. At the same time, when students find that they get employed within a couple of months or much quicker than other students who were not equally prepared, then we achieve graduate satisfaction.
Next, Lee Bullard, who again is UNCW's General Education Assessment Coordinator.
So just like with traditional assessments, it's all about the alignment. So for accreditation purposes, or just well-designed student learning goals, outcomes, and experiences, you start with what you want your students to know. So we have overarching learning goals here at the university, and they're things like information literacy, written communication. Well, it's really thoughtful expression and encompasses both written and oral communication. And then from that, we operationalize those learning goals into student learning outcomes that are aligned with different components of our university studies, which is our Gen Ed program. And then from there, each course has student learning outcomes that then align with the learning activities and the assessments in the course. So as long as we can draw that line and make a case, it's about claim, evidence, and reasoning, then we can make the case for accreditation that traditional or authentic assessment is doing what we need it to do.
I would like to turn our focus to how students might be involved specifically in the process and what benefits may be derived. Once again, Lee.
Choice, reflection, and co-creation, I think, are important, and they're easy to involve students with. So I want to talk about the co-creation piece to start with, because really involving students in thinking about what does success look like for this particular assignment that you're doing? What would be the markers of success that we should be looking for here? And really asking their opinion and having them help create things like rubrics. For choice, giving students the option of choosing different ways of preparing their assessment product allows them to choose the one that works better for their way of knowing, and then that and demonstrating their work. And that brings me to reflection, which I think is the key piece here. So by having students think about their learning before and after an assignment or an authentic assessment product, and asking them, what skills do you think you're going to use in this project? And then afterwards, and I think this is really important, asking students to really think about and write about, how do you think the skills that you used in this project might be applied in other scenarios? And having them look at things like what employers are looking for, and thinking about, what did I learn through the process of doing this assessment piece that I can then turn around and say to an employer in an interview, yes, I can do the thing I know how to problem solve, and here are concrete examples of that. And so I think that reflective piece is extremely important, and we shouldn't leave that out.
Joyce discusses how self and peer assessment lead to growth.
Both self-assessment and peer assessment lead to growth. Both indicate that students, or require actually, students to have a clear understanding of what they are being responsible for, expected of, what the standards are, what criteria they are going to be judged by, so they know exactly how a reviewer or an examiner is going to critique their work. What distinguishes self-assessment from peer assessment is that the person who criticizes their own work tries to see their work from another person's perspective and put on a hat of a reviewer and then switch back to their own hat and say, okay, this is what I wrote, but this is how it will be perceived. When we talk about peer assessment, both parties will benefit. The student who will learn to critique another person's work while giving them constructive feedback, giving them an idea of how they could improve their work in order to meet the requirements, while understanding that these students will feel that they are really invested in what is best for the student. And at the same time, it allows the student who's receiving feedback to be more open to feedback.
Might there be a hidden benefit for faculty in student self and peer assessment? Let's hear from Lee on that.
One of the biggest things is that it can take some of the work off faculty if you have students working on self-assessment and also assessing their peers in the course. Another thing is that it really mirrors what students will be doing in work once they leave the university, because they won't necessarily have, they'll have a boss, but they won't necessarily have a teacher who gives them feedback over time in a lower stakes situation before the high stakes projects come due. But I think metacognition, which is thinking about your own thinking, is so important in the role of learning anyway, because it helps students become more aware of how it is they learn best and what practices they can incorporate to assist with their learning. And I think it's as important as doing the actual task, making sure that students are thinking about what they had to go through to do the task and what worked and what didn't work.
Finally, Joyce truly underscored the importance of student reflection.
In terms of reflection, what we want in learning, we want students to acquire metacognition. We want them to be able to transfer what they have mastered in their short-term memory into their long-term memory. And that happens when they reflect on the task, they reflect on why the task was given, they reflect on the feedback that they have been given, and they reflect on how they attempted to improve their work.
As we wrap up this discussion on authentic assessment, I asked my guests what advice they would offer faculty. First, Sherry Conklin.
Start with a small class, see how that works. Just because you implement authentic assessment doesn't mean that you don't have to have multiple choice tests or tests, but add into, let's say, I would not say use publisher content, because then they're just going to go online, but even within tests, like ask them to explain the concepts or provide a case study where they have to. And again, that's grading on the faculty. But I think with that, you just need to look at your time of how you grade and when, and provide feedback. I would also say think about your learners, your audience. Are you teaching a class where they really don't have a lot of experience and it's elective? Like, that's an opportunity to get people to change their major. Like, get them excited about what you're doing and what you're passionate about by immersing them into something authentic. And then if, let's say, it's more of a major class, like, they should be out working in the field. So, what are their feelings? How are they applying the concepts? How can you redirect them? And again, reflection is an essential, I think, component of the assessment is good, but it's standalone. Like, you have to see the process of learning through their minds and how they feel they learned and how they ingested that content, and then whether or not they're proud of what they did.
Jen McCall.
Don't be afraid to try something, right? So if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. And you don't have to keep that assessment. You can trash it for another semester and revise it, but sometimes you get that magic. And that was what I found with this role-playing one when I read that. How are you going to deal with the cultural stigma of HIV, or how are you going to deal with the populations that have distrust in medical research? And it was beautiful because it wasn't what I was expecting to get. And so in order to find those, you really have to stretch yourself and experiment, try it, see if it works. But don't be afraid to trash it if it doesn't work. I think putting yourself in the role of the student is important too. Like, if I was a student, how could I apply what I learned, and how is this going to help me in my job? Because every class is designed to teach them something. And with our students, they are working professionals, they have jobs. So how can this help them in how they are implementing their professional lives? And so trying to have that perspective in assessing how you learn and apply what I've taught you can go a long way too.
Lee Bullard.
Start with one piece and work on a particular assessment. And I've been talking about learning opportunities and assessment as sort of the same things, and I really believe that they are. Assessment involves activities, but they're the same sorts of activities that you have students do in the learning process as well. So I want to be clear about that. But pick one assessment. Maybe it's a traditional assessment, a pencil paper assessment that had a lot of vocabulary on it, and think about how you can transform that into a process that really allows students to demonstrate what they know in terms of that content, but what can they do with that. Just pick one, start simple, and then you can revise from there. It doesn't have to be perfect to begin with. Look to your colleagues for help. And like I mentioned earlier, there's resources we have on campus. There's Center for Teaching Excellence. There's tons of online resources. CTE has an entire Canvas shell with tons of information that you might find something in there that can be helpful. But I think one of the better ways is to talk with your colleagues about it and see if they're doing something similar in their class, and really think about this from the perspective of, from the sort of meta perspective of what is it you want students to be able to do when 5 years down the road, when they're out of your class, what do you want them to be able to do as a result of having taken your class, and start designing your assessment around that.
Excellent advice. And of course, in distance education and e-learning, being part of teaching, learning, and library services and CTE, we also stand ready to help faculty. I thought we would end the episode with these sage words from Joyce.
People sometimes think of assessment as an additional task, which it is not. It is integral to anything that we do, and without it, we will be preventing ourselves the chance of growing.
I hope you've enjoyed our first foray into a subject-specific episode. Working this past semester with Dr. Jen McCall and Dr. Rhonda Vega, who unfortunately couldn't join us for this episode, was an absolute pleasure and an honor. We are a faculty-facing office in distance education and e-learning, meaning that we work primarily with UNCW faculty. We answer just-in-time email queries and set up one-on-one meetings and bookings. We offer faculty development workshops and all kinds of services, including working over a sustained period of time with faculty on course contracts. That's how my instructional designer teammate, Tara Hours, and I crossed paths with Jen and Rhonda. The highlight of that experience for me was working on their authentic assessment. In fact, I told Jen during this interview that it almost felt like a jazz session as the four of us brainstormed together, pitched what-ifs, and lobbed ideas back and forth as the role-playing discussion board assignment, truly an authentic assessment, came into being. It was truly a creative convergence, and as you've heard, involved a lot of logistics and work on everyone's part. The outcome was so worth it. Jen and Rhonda now have an authentic assessment promoting meaningful student dialogue and reflection, and we have this episode, which we hope you've enjoyed. Here's the deal. Teaching and Learning by Design at UNCW and Beyond is hosted by Jennifer Sias, a senior instructional designer in distance education and e-learning. Our intention is to produce one episode monthly, focusing on, as the title implies, teaching, learning, instructional design and technology, and videography at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Stay tuned for future episodes on topics like the role of gamification in higher education, best practices in blended learning, designing effective online courses, leveraging instructional technology for engaged learning, building interactive and accessible learning materials, and more. Join us next time for episode 4, which will focus on instructional video in online, hybrid, and web-enhanced courses. I would like to thank Dr. Joyce Behuth, Associate Director for Institutional Assessment for the Watson College of Education and the Cameron School of Business, Dr. April Braswell, Associate Professor in the School of Nursing, Lee Bullard, General Education Assessment Coordinator, Dr. Sherry Conklin, Associate Professor of Instructional Technology, and Dr. Jennifer McCall, Associate Professor in the School of Nursing. Many thanks to UNCW Libraries, particularly the Maker Studio personnel, including Jason Fleming, Cole Morgan, and Alyssa Wharton, for their help as I use their state-of-the-art podcast studio, which, by the way, is available to everyone at UNCW by making an appointment via Maker Studio online. Thanks also to OUR staff members, including Andrea Weaver and Jesse Bradley, for lending me an ear and really helpful advice. Thanks to Mr. Daniel Wright, creator of the Relevate podcast, for his excellent advice, as well as Lee Klein, co-host of the podcast Business Beyond the Classroom. For more information and to get in touch, please visit our website, tinyurl.com/UNCW deal. That's tinyurl.com/UNCW DEEL. Until next time, this has been Here's the Deal by Jennifer Sias.